I still remember the first time my father took me to the cinema to see Mortal Kombat. I was only 13 years old then. My dad lied to the ticket seller and got me into the theatre because at the time in the UK, you had to be at least 15 to see it. It was one of the greatest things my father ever did for me. I still clearly remember sitting in the dark theatre, my heart beating faster with every techno drum beat, and then the moment I still can't forget to this day when Liu Kang throws Reptile into the statue, his body transforms, and a voice calls out, "Reptile." The entire theatre exploded. It was the moment that made me, and so many Mortal Kombat fans, say, "That's awesome," for the first time, and I knew I would carry that memory with me for many years to come. But only as I grew older and looked back did I realise this Mortal Kombat 1995 didn't just shock audiences on screen. What happened behind the scenes was far crazier. This was the video game movie that broke the Hollywood curse at a time when game adaptations were almost synonymous with disaster. An iconic character like Johnny Cage was actually born from an unfinished dream. And there's one detail few people would ever expect: a legendary character like Reptile was created in a last-minute panic, completely absent from the original script. And it didn't stop there. There were fights that left real injuries and casting decisions that felt like a survival tournament before filming had even begun. And today we are going to open once again the darkest and strangest behind-the-scenes doors of Mortal Kombat 1995. 20. The video game movie that broke the Hollywood curse. Do you remember this feeling? Walking into a theatre in the mid-1990s, the moment the words, "based on the hit video game," appeared on screen, a familiar thought would already form in your mind. Here comes another bad movie. At the time, video game adaptations were almost synonymous with failure. Super Mario Bros. Left audiences confused. Double Dragon was widely ridiculed. Street Fighter made money, but was treated as a joke. Hollywood had formed an unspoken rule: games could not become good movies. Mortal Kombat was born right in the middle of that context. No one expected anything. No one believed in it. To many people in the industry, it was just another gamble headed straight for the same old crash. Even major studios stayed away, viewing the project as a risk not worth taking. But there was one person who didn't think that way. Producer Lawrence Kasanoff believed that Mortal Kombat could do what earlier game movies couldn't preserve the original spirit. Not civilize the game, not turn it into a harmless family film, and not mock its own origins. He believed audiences wanted to see what they had played: a deadly tournament, clearly defined characters, and fights that were staged for real. When the film was released in 1995, the seemingly impossible happened. Mortal Kombat didn't just survive at the box office, it won. The box office gross far exceeded expectations. Audiences flocked to theatres. The soundtrack played constantly on MTV, and for the first time in Hollywood history, a video game adaptation was acknowledged as a success. Not because it was perfect, not because it was refined, but because Mortal Kombat proved something crucial. Video game movies didn't have to be bad, and for breaking that curse alone, the film secured its place in the history of popular cinema. 19. Johnny Cage, Jean-Claude Van Damme's unfinished dream. If you grew up in the late 1980s or early 1990s, the name Jean-Claude Van Damme probably needs no introduction. The Split kicks the sweat-slicked muscular physique VHS tapes of Bloodsport or Kickboxer rewound until the tape wore thin. For many people, Van Damme was mainstream martial arts for an entire generation. Few people know that Mortal Kombat did not originally exist in the form we know today. Ed Boon and John Tobias's original project was a fighting game built around Jean-Claude Van Damme himself. Midway wanted to digitize him, turning him into the central character of an arcade game, a very 1990s dream where an action star stepped straight from the movie screen into the arcade cabinet. But negotiations fell apart. Van Damme didn't sign on. The project collapsed. And out of that void, Johnny Cage was born a vain movie star turned fighter, flashy and self-absorbed, with moves and personality lifted directly from Van Damme's on-screen image. It was both a tribute and a tongue-in-cheek industry joke that only insiders fully understood. Ironically, when Mortal Kombat was adapted into a film, Van Damme was offered the role of Johnny Cage and turned it down to star in Street Fighter. A character born from his shadow slipped through his fingers twice. History took a different turn, and Johnny Cage ultimately belonged to Lyndon Ashby, not a star name, but a surprisingly perfect fit. 18. Sonya Blade, the female warrior with no stunt double. Do you remember Sonya Blade back then? The icy stare when facing Kano. The clean, decisive joint locks. The upright stance, never stepping back in the Mortal Kombat arena. What set Sonya apart wasn't her costume or special effects. It was the very real sense that this character could feel pain but would never give up. And that feeling wasn't acting. Bridget Wilson-Sampras performed all of her own stunts, refusing to use a stunt double, even for the most demanding close combat scenes. Every fall, every hold, every impact was real physical contact. She wasn't protected by effects, only by willpower. When Cameron Diaz had to withdraw after breaking her wrist, Wilson was called in under emergency circumstances. There was no real time to prepare. She trained while filming and then dislocated her shoulder on set. Doctors and the crew insisted she stop. But Wilson shook her head. She adjusted her movements herself, clenched her teeth through the pain, and kept filming to complete the scene. Not because she was reckless, but because she refused to abandon the role. That resilience earned the respect of the entire crew. Not because she was good at enduring pain, but because she protected the character until the very end. As a result, Sonya Blade on screen wasn't polished or perfect. She was tough, unyielding, and so alive it couldn't be faked. And perhaps that's why Sonya Blade became an icon, the first female warrior of Mortal Kombat for an entire generation of viewers. A character born in a game but etched into memory through sweat injury and the very real resolve of the woman behind her. 17. Van Damme turned down. Johnny Cage and history took a different turn. Do you remember how Johnny Cage first appeared in Mortal Kombat 1995? Not with a grand entrance, no signature blow to define him. Just a Hollywood star in sunglasses, talking more than he fights, stepping into the tournament with smug confidence and quickly being treated like a joke among real warriors. From the very beginning, the film makes one thing clear. Johnny Cage is not the center of the arena. He's an outsider, someone who has to prove that he even belongs there. What few people realize is that Johnny Cage wasn't merely inspired by Jean-Claude Van Damme. The character was almost created specifically for him. From the action star image and flashy bravado to the idea of a movie fighter stepping into a real combat world, Cage carries Van Damme's DNA, a blend of tribute and satire aimed at 1990s Hollywood. When the Mortal Kombat film project began taking shape, Van Damme was genuinely offered the role of Johnny Cage. But at that moment, he faced another option: Street Fighter, a more globally recognized franchise with a bigger budget and far less risk. Mortal Kombat, by contrast, was still seen as violent, strange, and unstable. Van Damme chose guile, and with that single decision, he walked away from Johnny Cage. That rejection forced the filmmakers to completely rethink the character. Johnny Cage was no longer a flawless symbol tailored for a superstar, but a deeply flawed figure, loud, arrogant, easily dismissed, yet gradually shaped by the fights he survives. Ironically, it was Van Damme's absence that allowed Johnny Cage in Mortal Kombat 1995 to become more human, more relatable, and ultimately more memorable. 16. Fascinating behind-the-scenes details few people know. If you ever heard Scorpion roar, "Get over here," and felt chills, there's a memorable truth behind it. Ed Boon himself, co-creator of Mortal Kombat, was the one who voiced that line. No professional voice actor, no elaborate processing. It was his real voice, and it became a sound etched into the memory of an entire generation of gamers. On the opposite side, Sub-Zero was given to the actor with the strongest martial arts background on set. The performer held multiple black belts across different disciplines, allowing his strikes, guards, and movement to look sharp, cold, and precise on screen, perfectly fitting the icy assassin even when visual effects were still very limited. Almost happened stories were everywhere. Jean-Claude Van Damme was once offered the role of Johnny Cage, but turned it down in favour of Street Fighter, a decision that inadvertently turned Cage into a satire of Van Damme himself. Steven Spielberg, a fan of the game, nearly made a cameo appearance. He ultimately didn't appear, but the film's director character was modelled after Spielberg as a subtle tribute. Tom Cruise even visited the set while he was in Thailand, but was quickly asked to leave because he had nothing to do with the movie. And perhaps most interesting of all, Kano's character in the games was later changed to be Australian solely because of Trevor Goddard's standout performance in the film. A small behind-the-scenes decision, but one that was enough to alter the character's history across the entire franchise. These details don't make Mortal Kombat a better film in an artistic sense, but they make it feel more real, more human, and more memorable, true to the spirit of a legend born from passion and a great deal of improvisation. 15. Mortal Kombat casting a tournament before the cameras rolled. Try to recall the feeling of watching Mortal Kombat for the first time the characters step onto the screen with faces that feel perfectly right, as if they were born to stand in that arena. But few people know that before Shang Tsung ever shouted, Fight the film's casting process itself was already a real survival tournament. In the early stages, the list of candidates sounded like a Hollywood dream of the early 1990s. Jean-Claude Van Damme was considered for Johnny Cage. Tom Cruise and Johnny Depp were discussed. Sean Connery was offered the role of Raiden. Brandon Lee was the top choice for Liu Kang. Cameron Diaz had been cast as Sonya Blade and had already begun training. Steven Spielberg, a fan of the game, even nearly made a cameo as Johnny Cage's director. But one by one, those names fell away because of scheduling conflicts, injuries, image concerns, and even real-life tragedy when the actor slated to play Jax passed away before filming began. One by one, the big stars vanished from the arena, leaving behind a film that seemed to have lost all of its box office guarantees. In the end, the ones who remained were not the most glamorous names, but the right ones. That brutal process of elimination inadvertently saved Mortal Kombat. The film wasn't weighed down by star images didn't need to perform for appearances, but instead delivered a feeling that the fights were real. And sometimes that is exactly what a video game movie needs more than any big name. 14. Shang Tsung didn't act. He stepped straight out of Outworld. Do you remember Shang Tsung's gaze in the film Cold Sharp and full of menace? And the truth is, he barely needed to act that look at all. More than that, every time he appeared was enough to make the room fall silent through his slow, measured voice, and the sense that everyone around him was merely a piece on a board whose fate had already been decided. This wasn't the loud, bombastic villain of 1990s action films, it was a quiet threat. That presence wasn't created on set, it emerged from the very casting session. Kari Hiroyuki Tagawa walked into the audition room, put on the costume, climbed onto a chair and stared straight at the crew as if he already owned the space. No introductions, no asking permission, no adjustments. He dominated the room through sheer presence alone. And that was Shang Tsung. No need to perform, no need to explain psychology. The character's menace lies in spiritual authority in the feeling of being watched and judged. If you look back at the scenes in the film, you'll notice that Shang Tsung rarely rushes. He stands still in the arena, forcing others to move to his rhythm. The way he speaks of souls of laws of Outworld feels ritualistic rather than overtly threatening. That is why this character rises above the typical final boss of a video game movie of that era. Shang Tsung didn't become a memorable villain because of special effects or violence. but because he made audiences believe that their souls had belonged to Outworld long before they realised it. 13. Reptile, the moment Mortal Kombat truly came to life. Do you remember the moment when Liu Kang defeats the strange creature and then hurls its body into a stone wall? In an instant, it springs back up in human form, and a voice rings out with a single word, Reptile. For many viewers, that was the moment they exclaimed, "Yes, this is Mortal Kombat." From a script standpoint, this was just a secondary fight, but emotionally, it was the most important turning point in the entire film. Up until then, Mortal Kombat could still be seen as a martial arts fantasy movie with a video game flavour. But the second Reptile reveals himself, the film officially confirms to the audience that the game world has stepped into reality without lengthy explanations, without clumsy introductions. What makes this scene linger in memory is how it was staged. No flashy CGI, no explanatory dialogue. Just a very physical action, a body slammed into a wall and a brief pause before the name Reptile is spoken. That rhythm feels exactly like unlocking a secret fight in the game, sudden, efficient, and exhilarating. The pounding techno music underneath amplifies that feeling. In those few seconds, Liu Kang stops being merely a film character and becomes a stand-in for the player stepping into a fight that Mortal Kombat fans had been waiting for. Looking back today, the effects and choreography in the Reptile scene may clearly bear the mark of the 1990s. But that very roughness is what makes it unforgettable. This is not a scene that is technically perfect. It is a scene that arrives at exactly the right moment with the right spirit and the exact feeling Mortal Kombat audiences wanted most, the moment when the film stops explaining and starts fighting for real. 12. Tom Cruise was once asked to leave the set. In the mid-1990s, Tom Cruise was not just a movie star, he was a Hollywood force. Wherever he appeared, attention immediately followed. And what few people know is that Cruise once showed up on the set of Mortal Kombat and was then asked to leave. While the production was filming in Thailand, Tom Cruise happened to be in the area and visited the set in a purely personal capacity. No role, no cameo, no direct involvement with the project. But the presence of an A-list superstar on a small high-pressure set racing against time quickly caused disruption. Rumours began to spread. The focus of those around the set shifted away from the film itself and toward Tom Cruise is here, for a project that was already fragile, viewed with skepticism by Hollywood and constantly at risk of being dismissed. This was something the production could not afford. The decision was made clearly and calmly. Tom Cruise was politely asked to leave the set. No noise, no public argument, just a boundary that needed to be maintained. Mortal Kombat could not afford to carry the shadow of any superstar. The film had to stand or fall on its own. In an era when video game movies were treated as a joke, saying no to a name like Tom Cruise became proof of Mortal Kombat's determination to survive a small film that refused to be swallowed by Hollywood. 11. When an action film became a survival test. Think back to the scenes set in Outworld ancient temples, thick mist, damp stone arenas, and a sense of heat that seems to radiate off the screen. What you're feeling is real. Mortal Kombat was filmed largely in Thailand under conditions so harsh that many cast and crew members described it as a physical endurance test rather than a film production. Extreme heat, heavy humidity, insects and food poisoning all occurred alongside an intense shooting schedule and constant fight scenes. There was no CGI to save them, no air-conditioned rooms between takes. The actors trained, performed action scenes, and then kept filming while exhausted. Some shooting days had to be cancelled because too many people were physically unable to continue. And that's why, when you see fighters step onto the arena floor drenched in sweat, breathing hard eyes tense, it isn't just acting. It's the human body being pushed to its real limits. 10. Goro, the million-dollar monster, both a marvel and a behind-the-scenes nightmare. There was a moment in Mortal Kombat when theatres in 1995 almost fell silent when Goro stepped out of the shadows, his massive body towering 4 muscular arms flexing each footstep, heavy enough to seem to shake the arena itself. At the time, no one asked, "Where's the CGI?" because what stood on screen looked far too real to be fake. Goro was not a computer effect. He was an animatronic costing nearly $1 million, requiring around 16 people at once to operate his arms, head, chest, and facial expressions. Every appearance by Goro was a technical operation in itself, overheating mechanical failures, freezing mid-strike. Behind the camera, the monster constantly slowed production, pushing the crew to exhaustion. In front of the lens, he was the embodiment of Outworld's power. Behind the scenes, he was the thing that made the director and crew sweat even more than the actors. And yet, it was precisely that imperfection that created a version of Goro audiences would never forget. 9. Betting everything on animatronics and real stunt performers. Today, a poorly angled kick can be fixed in post-production. In 1995, it couldn't. Mortal Kombat was made in an era when, if a fight looked fake, the film was finished. Instead of relying on CGI, the filmmakers chose the hardest path: real stunt performers, real martial arts, real physical contact. Liu Kang's spinning kicks, Sonya's joint locks, Johnny Cage's near-miss dodges, all of it was trained and performed like a traditional martial arts film. Animatronics' wire rigs, heavy props, direct impacts, every action scene was a gamble placed on the actors' bodies. That is why the fights in Mortal Kombat have weight, a very real sense of pain, completely different from the smooth, hollow feel of many modern action films. Watching it today, the effects may feel dated, but the sensation of real people fighting in front of the camera is still there, and that is something CGI has never been able to replicate. 8. Forced into a PG-13 rating. Despite being born from the bloodiest game of the 1990s, there is something very strange about watching Mortal Kombat in 1995. You remember seeing a lot of blood, yet when you look closely, there is almost none. That feeling isn't your memory playing tricks on you. It's because the film was forced to pull its punches from the very beginning. In the early 1990s, Mortal Kombat wasn't just a popular game. It was at the center of US congressional hearings on video game violence. The game's graphic fatalities directly contributed to the creation of the ESRB rating system. In that climate, a truly blood-soaked Mortal Kombat film faithful to the source was almost impossible. New Line Cinema understood this very clearly. If the film received an R rating, the younger audience, the game's largest fan base, would be shut out of theaters. The result was a life-or-death decision, PG-13, which meant blood had to disappear, fatalities had to be toned down, and violence had to be suggested rather than shown. Mortal Kombat on screen thus became a paradox, a film born from the most violent game of the decade, yet forced to restrain itself simply to survive. 7. Politics, censorship, and the blood behind Mortal Kombat. What you don't see on screen can sometimes be more intense than what is shown. With Mortal Kombat, the real battle didn't take place only between Earthrealm and Outworld, but also between the filmmakers and the American censorship system. Every fight scene was scrutinized closely. Where the blood appeared, how much was too much? Which camera angles made a blow look too real? Some scenes were fully shot and edited, only to be cut or altered right before release, due to concerns over political and media backlash. Not because the film was excessively violent, but because at the time, the United States was especially sensitive to anything involving violence and children. The irony is that removing the blood is precisely what allowed Mortal Kombat to reach a much wider audience. Children were allowed into theaters. Parents accepted it. The box office exploded. Meanwhile, attentive fans could still feel the brutality beneath the surface through sound design, through character reactions, and through the way the camera deliberately avoided the final moments. Mortal Kombat won a battle. Few people noticed, It survived an era in which politics and censorship could kill an entire franchise simply by slipping through a narrow gap just wide enough to avoid being crushed. 6. Reptile wasn't in the script. There is a scene in Mortal Kombat that made 1995 audiences almost lean forward in their seats when Liu Kang enters a dark room, green light flickering, and a strange creature suddenly lunges at him, fast, feral, and unlike any opponent before. Reptile appears as if the film has suddenly swerved in an entirely different direction, and that's exactly what happened. Reptile did not exist in the original script. The character was added very late after the filmmakers received feedback that the movie needed one more fight and needed a truly shocking moment for game fans. There was no time for proper preparation, no elaborate design. Everything was assembled hastily from what was already available. A reused ninja costume movements shot in a rush, and Reptile's transformation created with extremely limited effects by today's standards. But that very urgency produced a sense of real danger. An enemy that appears without warning, strikes quickly, is dealt with swiftly, and disappears. In the games, Reptile was always a secret character. On film, he was born in much the same way a secret created out of panic, yet one that became one of the most memorable moments in Mortal Kombat. Sometimes, the things created out of fear endure longer than those carefully planned. 5. The fights were more than just for show. If you ever flinched when Liu Kang was slammed onto the stone floor, or when Sonya Blade fell so hard it seemed impossible for her to get back up immediately, that feeling didn't come entirely from acting. Many of the falls, kicks and impacts in Mortal Kombat were real. In the mid-1980s, action films still relied heavily on practical martial arts and live stunt work. There was no CGI to soften movements, no motion capture to correct posture. When actors were thrown to the ground, they really hit the ground. When they were kicked, the force of the impact was not erased. Robin Shu Liu Kang suffered injuries during the filming of high-intensity fight scenes, while Bridget Wilson, Sonya Blade, continued shooting even after dislocating her shoulder. Long shooting days on slippery arenas, hard stone floors, and in harsh weather made bruises and injuries a routine part of production. On screen, these became smooth, clean, high-energy action sequences. But behind the camera, Mortal Kombat was a film where the actors paid with their own bodies. Perhaps that is why even today, when viewers rewatch those fights, they still feel something very real, not because of perfect effects, but because the pain was real. 4. The legendary techno track that almost didn't exist. If you were sitting in a theatre in 1995 and heard the chant "Mortal Kombat" explode out of a black screen, chances are your heart started pounding before the first fight even began. That wasn't just background music, it was the moment the entire theatre felt electrified, a sound that instantly told you something very different was happening. But few people know that this legendary techno track almost wasn't used. Originally, Mortal Kombat was envisioned with a more traditional cinematic score leaning toward familiar fantasy martial arts tones. Techno was considered too loud, too modern, and above all too risky for a video game adaptation that was already viewed with skepticism. Composer The Immortals had to fight to preserve that pure electronic spirit. And when the track was tested during internal screenings, the audience reaction was nearly immediate. The energy spiked, the atmosphere shifted, and the feeling of this is Mortal Kombat locked in within the first few seconds. You already know the outcome. The Mortal Kombat soundtrack went platinum, climbed the Billboard charts, blasted across MTV arcades, bedrooms, and car stereos cranked to full volume on 1990s highways. A track that almost got cut became the soul of the entire film, and perhaps the very first thing that comes to mind even before you remember any of the characters. 3. Audiences loved it, critics didn't. Have you ever put Mortal Kombat on again after many years and found yourself smiling from the very first frames, even though you know full well the film is far from refined? If so, you're not alone. From the moment it was released, Mortal Kombat was labelled a B-movie by critics, a simple script, blunt dialogue, a loud style, and no attempt to hide its own excess. But that is exactly what audiences loved about it. Mortal Kombat never tried to be smarter than its own nature. It felt like walking into a theatre in 1995 simply to watch video game characters come to life, to feel techno music hit you in the chest, and to see kicks and punches performed by real bodies, not computers. While critics scored the film using traditional cinematic standards, audiences judged it by memory the first time they saw Scorpion shoot out his chain. The first time they heard that familiar shout, the first moment they realised, this is the game I play every day right in front of me. Mortal Kombat didn't need to be praised as a great film, it needed to be remembered. And over time, that very gap turned the movie into a cult classic. Not because it was perfect, but because it became inseparably tied to a generation of viewers, people who even today can turn up the music, recite the lines by heart, and smile at a film that was once dismissed but never forgotten. 2. A box office smash. The shock of an era when game movies failed. Try placing yourself back in 1995. At the time, the phrase video game adaptation was almost synonymous with disaster. Super Mario Bros. Collapsed spectacularly. Double Dragon vanished without a trace. Street Fighter made money, but was mercilessly mocked. No one walked into the theatre believing that Mortal Kombat would be the exception. And then the unexpected happened. Mortal Kombat opened strong, quickly climbed to the #1 spot at the North American box office, and finished its theatrical run with over $120 million worldwide, many times its production budget. For a film considered a risk, it was a direct punch to every Hollywood preconception. The shock wasn't just in the numbers, but in the message behind them. Audiences wanted to see their games treated with respect. They wanted real martial arts, real actors, and the original spirit preserved. Mortal Kombat didn't try to elevate itself, didn't try to earn critical approval. It did one thing. Well, it brought the game experience to the screen in the most direct way possible. In an era when video game films were seen as a dead end, Mortal Kombat proved that failure was not an inevitable fate. And that box office victory opened a door Hollywood had never dared to touch before. 1. The film that paved the way for an entire franchise. Looking back at Mortal Kombat 1990 through today's lens, it's hard to call it a perfect film. Some of the effects are rough. The dialogue can feel awkward at times, and subtlety is certainly not its strength. Yet it is precisely that roughness that many viewers still remember so clearly. The feeling of sitting in a theatre that year, the techno music blasting, the dragon logo appearing, and the entire room holding its breath waiting for the familiar shout. Mortal Kombat never tried to become high art. It chose to stay faithful to the feeling of the game, simple, direct, violent enough, and full of energy. The film knew exactly what it was and never asked permission to be that way. At a time when Hollywood was still fumbling with video game adaptations, that imperfect but true to the spirit approach became its greatest strength. The success of Mortal Kombat opened an entirely new path. Sequels, animated films, television series, novelizations, and multiple reboots in the years that followed all trace their origins back to that first strike in 1995. More importantly, it proved that video games could live on the big screen if they were treated seriously without needing to be polished or tailored to please critics. For that reason, Mortal Kombat 1995 may not be refined, but it is foundational. A film that dared to step into the arena when everyone believed video game movies could only fall. And that opening blow allowed an entire franchise to survive, grow, and continue echoing its familiar battle cry for decades to come. So what about you? Which moment from Mortal Kombat 1995 do you remember most? Leave a comment, and if you want to keep unlocking deleted scenes and hidden stories from Hollywood's golden eras, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You may be surprised by what Hollywood has kept hidden from you for decades.